Thank you all for being here, and thank you to those who are watching the recording afterwards. I really appreciate your time, and hopefully you find this to be interesting and informative for your practice in your classroom or at your school. Thank you to Abby and ECIS and Paul Magnuson for the support and encouragement to present and the opportunity to. Just a bit about me. I'm a teacher at Leysin American School. I teach pre-AP 10th grade world history and geography. And in a previous life, I was an outdoor educator, and so that experiential and outdoor pedagogy and that approach really, uh, I think, forms the foundation of my pedagogical philosophy. And so when I transitioned from being an outdoor educator into working full time in schools and not just with schools, I wanted to be true to that part of my pedagogical philosophy and bring in some of the practices that I saw really work really well in the outdoor classroom into the history classroom. And I'm happy to share some of the ways that I've done that. So I'm going to share a presentation. The idea is to share a presentation, to go through, briefly some examples. I think perhaps it's best to teach through examples, or to share these ideas through examples. I have one scenario, which is just a very little taster for you. If you were my students in one of my simulations, where you'll have to make a decision and then you'll see the outcome of that decision. And then for the bulk of it, open it up to discussion and questions. If anything comes up, I suppose, during during my talk, if anything is unclear, if anyone needs any clarification, feel free to maybe type something in the chat, or I believe, I don't know, I can't remember if Zoom has the option to where you can digitally raise a hand, or yeah, kind of stop me. But feel free. It is meant to be an exchange. And so without further ado, let's move over. I'm going to share my screen. And I believe, is it, if no one says no one says anything that if no one says that you can't see, I'm assuming you can.
I can see it. I can
Great.
see the PowerPoint.
Fantastic. So just a real quick overview, teaching through simulations. What do I mean by simulations? Why I believe in them? Some examples and some questions. So the University of New South Wales has a really great definition. So rather than reinventing the wheel, it's instructional scenarios where you're placed in a world defined by a teacher to represent a reality where students interact. And of course, as the teacher, we all like control, and so we control the parameters of the world, and use that to help students achieve the learning outcomes. As Paul says, creating a fake scenario to make learning real. I believe in this approach. One thing that we did a few years ago in our professional learning communities at school, we have these small working groups. I was with some math teachers and science teachers, and we went around and asked people within our departments what they remember from classes that when they were students. And a lot of the things that people remembered, a lot of the things that teachers remembered, of course, were the personalities of their teachers. But when it came to classroom experiences, it was often more active, more there were I can't remember very many people saying there was a really great lecture on mercantilism, and so it sort of bears out with our own little anecdotal survey here. So I'll share some small effort examples. These very kind of off the shelf. They take less preparation. They might require some material, but these are kind of some small examples. This is the pre-AP world history pathway to begins. The historical period begins in 1453 with the Ottoman conquest of the walls of Constantinople. I know, very exciting history that you're all very familiar with, and the students as well. And so to introduce that concept rather than just talking about it or showing paintings depicting it. I use Duplo Legos to have students build defensive walls that they hope will stand up to different size artillery, because Ottoman artillery and advancements in weaponry was one of the uh, core concepts to look at. And so students get, gradually larger artillery to try and destroy these Duplo walls. And you can see artillery. Oh, causing some damage. You can also see, if you were to visit my classroom, my whiteboards have dents that are dimpled from the golf balls from errant artillery shots. Artillery. A little bit, yeah, a little bit interesting. This sometimes the seasons conspire to give you the opportunity to go outside, and so one year it just so happened right around the time that we were exploring this, the nature provided some fantastic building material. So I did the same activity, except students were building with snow. And then you can see them there destroying the walls. Acting, this is, kind of using metaphors. If World War I was a bar fight, perhaps not appropriate for all students of all levels in all parts of the world, but it is, I think, it's an interesting and active review or introduction. It is by no means takes the place of the rigorous investigation and academic investigation of primary and secondary sources about World War I, but it is, I think, a way to perhaps hook students into this concept or to review it. And so those are both small scale examples. Some medium effort examples, they require more preparation time. They might also take up more lesson time or multiple lessons, and sometimes they need additional help. Something that has made preparation time a bit more efficient is the being able to generate manipulatives with AI, like DALL-E. So getting that to help create, the manipulatives, like the resources that students may be trading. So there are that's one way that I've integrated AI or used AI to make my to help make my job a bit easier, or at least reduce the time that I need to perhaps invest in producing materials for the, and you'll see one of those manipulatives, one of those cards in a little bit. Some topic examples. So, and the Indian Ocean trade, sort of pre-European arrival, Indian Ocean trade, mercantilism again, and collective agriculture. Very, very, top 10 exciting topics in a history classroom. So I know things that most people are fairly familiar with, but topics that I think can be enhanced through simulations. Here you just see some pictures. Of course, you can probably date them from when they were taken, based on the mask wearing protocol. But here you see Paul Magnuson and students engaging in the Indian Ocean trade. And something that I really like about simulations is that they have the ability to, they're really dynamic. So this is an example. Some students knocked some of the cards off of the table, and the cards were porcelain. And so I responded in a way that was like, I was like, oh, it's, you've broken this porcelain, you have to pay for it. And so it was very, yeah, it was just very, it's those moments that make the simulation really specific to those students in that scenario, and really individual, something that can't be recreated. But then the more times you do the simulation, you can add in things like, in this simulation, Paul was getting a bit overwhelmed, and he was the harbor master in the port of in Canton. And so he said, I'm closed, I have to kind of organize myself. It was nothing I told him to do, but something I realized, oh, this is actually this is something that happened, and so ports could close, and then students would have the opportunity to smuggle where there was higher risk, high reward, and um, and so it just really the ability for the simulation to absorb, I think, is really interesting. Mercantilism, I don't have any pictures from this one that were that particularly enhanced the concept, but through this, it's uh, capitalism 1.0, very much colonial, um, uh, a colonial imbalance of markets, so that colonies were always kept beholden to parent countries, back in Europe often. And so one of the big learning outcomes from this was the importance of joint stock companies, and that movement away from large, really away from how governments were the only entities that could really finance large ventures, to the private sector in concert with governments being able to do that. And students organically, like without being given the option, asked if they could join companies. And so that, and in doing so, they gained an advantage that basically allowed them to swallow up their other competition within the simulation. And it was nothing that I had planned for or anticipated, but I was fortunate enough to have very clever students, and also to have recreated a world in which the incentives were there. And so the students, saw that actually, if they were allowed to do this, they would be able to gain an advantage. Uh, Collective agriculture, particularly the Great Leap Forward, is one of the simulations I've developed here, and you can see students, um, you know, doing their best to manage all the various scenarios that they were given. And I've been talking for a little bit, so I'm going to give you one of those scenarios. I can perhaps zoom in. I can't quite zoom in. So this is a scenario that the students encountered during their collective agricultural management. Their commune is being attacked by these four pests: um, sparrows, rats, flies, and other insects. And they're eating the seeds in the food storage. So you have two options. Would you like to leave them alone? Option A, and that requires no labor, so no workers. Or would you like to exterminate them? Option B. And so you can actually type into the chat what your choice would be. As a teacher, I'll give you 10 seconds. I don't actually. Let me see if I can go back to the Zoom and see what people have chosen. So I see people, Christian and Sarah, you've chosen option B. Does anyone else want to say their option? Fantastic. And so I will say, if you've chosen to exterminate, the outcome is that you would now face this locust swarm. And so it's, of course, um, the natural desire is, yeah, you've been informed by the government authorities, like, these things are pests, and you need to, they're harming your agricultural yield. But in reacting, perhaps it is possible to overreact and to create another ecological problem. And so that is something that students faced. There are larger effort ones. These ones are really, I would say, quite inspired by my my background as an outdoor educator. So this is another topic when looking at the origins of the Chinese Communist Party, and something that is still part of the Chinese Communist Party's um, uh, part of their propaganda today, part of their origin story, or something they talk that is quite often referenced as the Long March. And so in this is, the students had to put together a bridge to escape from campus. And then we went actually on a hike. They had to cook for themselves. I was giving them inspirational speeches. Here, we were quite near an airport. And so I had them get down as a plane happened to fly by, just as a way to try and enhance the experience. And then I even had, this was done with the help of a actual professional outdoor company, so everything met safety standards and protocols. And students were not required to do this, but were given the option to, challenge by choice, to be like uh, the commandos that crossed a bridge where the slats had been removed and secured the other side of the bridge and allowed the rest of the army to move through. I saw this was about 7 or 8 years ago, and I saw these students at an alumni event last year, and the first thing they bring up is this experience. And then those are arriving at the end. The final thing I'll talk about before opening it up to questions and discussion is a long-term simulation that I ran. This I've run actually for the past 2 years, and they can run multiple weeks. Requires a lot of front loading, but the idea is that it becomes more autonomous, and these do come with additional costs. So I ran it's called Statecraft. It's an international relation simulation, and it's fairly, you can customize it to your own school's needs in terms of how long, how often turns happen, and how large the group sizes are, whether or not teachers are involved or not. I think this would be actually a really quite a fun simulation, or quite a fun game to run with colleagues rather than just students. So that's just to put that idea out there as well. So students were in charge of their own countries. They have to manage their own domestic factions. So they have capitalists, environmentalists, libertarians, and their populations are made up of different, it adds up to 100%, but let's say, they have certain factions have more power based on a host of other variables. Then they also have to contend with international issues, piracy, extremism, border disputes. Also, you might notice this frozen landmass at the north. That is ice mountain. It is melting and causing sea level rise. And so they have to manage their resources, invest in different parts of their country, and also collaborate with other countries, or not. They can also choose to take things in a more contentious and more adversarial approach, and it can get pretty intense. These are some things that students said in a survey. One of the things at the beginning of the simulation I had, and I'll just go back while I make this point. At the beginning of the simulation, I had them kind of go through, what's a domestic faction and what does quality of life mean? And they really had very little understanding of these concepts. But at the end of the 12 weeks, they were really talking about them in really eloquent ways, and ways that really showed through the experience of the simulation that using these concepts rather than just reading about them or being talked to about them, they really, things really clicked for them. And so, it's impossible to make everyone happy. I think someone says, right, it was, for them to please the environmentalists, it upset the capitalists, and so there are these real, they're learning about how the world really works. And of course, it's important to put the caveat on of how the parameters of a simulated world are not the same as the real world, but it is a really good, interesting entry point into these concepts. Here it talks about they're struggling with the impacts of global warming, And it would have been great for us to know the consequences of global warming. It's like, if only there were, a host of international scientists that were talking about the potential impacts. So, and then here talking about how changing away from military investments because it prevented them from investing in other parts of their quality of life. And then just this also comes in the 20th century. I'm going to stop sharing now. Um, well, those are my closing thoughts. So for the recording, I'll put them there. And I'll just go back to me. Hello. We were talking about things like NATO and the Warsaw Pact, and there were collective security agreements within the statecraft world that the students formed themselves. And so it's one thing to learn about the idea of collective security, but it's another thing to be able to refer to it in a way that students have this personal experience with it. Like, don't you remember in the statecraft there were the group of these 3 countries and these 4 countries? And they go, oh yeah. And I go, so that's, in what ways is it similar? In what ways is it different? Another was, just discussing military expenditure during the Cold War, and asking them during the statecraft simulation, did you want to invest in other aspects of your country? And many of them said yes. And I said, well, why did you invest so heavily in military? Oh, because other countries were. Well, now you understand what an arms race is. Or now you have a personal connection to that in a simulated way. And I think so I have other thoughts. I could talk about this quite often, but I do want to open it up for discussion and questions. Thank you very much for listening to that part, and I hope there might be some further discussion if people are still out there. So, Christian, yeah, you just feel free to unmute yourself and just jump in.
Great. Thank you for the presentation and creating great activities for kids. One of the challenges I have sometimes found is unless students have done something similar before, it's sometimes difficult to get them going. So I worked with one schools where they have never done anything like this, and it was very challenging for them to overcome that. So I'm curious whether you've seen that and then how to scaffold such activities, and also other challenges, whether they come from admin that's not supportive or parents who are skeptical, what might seem, like playing rather than learning.
Definitely. So really great questions. In terms of scaffolding, it depends on, and we have this too, we have students coming from very, let's say, didactic backgrounds where it's stand and deliver, and it can be quite different, but also anxiety, it can cause a bit of anxiety for them to have to, or to be asked to learn in this way. And so smaller, the Lego, like the Lego wall, like giving them 15-20 minutes doing something like that, and then having them go through that experience, and then providing literature resources where they then connect what they did in the classroom clearly to the history concept, is a way to get a bit of buy-in from the students. And so I wouldn't, there's a reason that statecraft is introduced 6 months in, after students have had various, after they've had sort of more experience with simulations that require a bit less investment, right? And so, or less, it's not as, it's kind of easing them into the process. So I think when you're looking at kind of your yearly plan, jumping in with something that's a bit ambitious may end up being counterproductive in terms of yeah, maybe counterproductive just because students don't get it and you end up in September or October and you sort of have to reassess. So I think structuring things where it's sort of low and then eventually to medium term, and then those longer term simulations are the best way to scaffold things. I'm very aware that I'm particular. So just going to the other questions about parents and play and administration, I'm very aware that not all, that teachers are dealing with a lot of sometimes conflicting priorities or just, so many different things. I'm very fortunate to be at a school that is supportive of this approach. I also don't have high stakes testing, outside of the classroom, no IB testing, no AP testing, which I'm very grateful for. We do the pre-AP performance tasks and these sorts of things. So there are these outside metrics. It's not pure simulation approach. It's complemented with, I would say, more traditional classroom approaches. In terms of parents, I'm at a boarding school, so it's always interesting. I think I'm able to, when they find out about these approaches, it's normally through the newsletter, so I'm able to, take pictures or have our marketing department come down and take pictures and then give a blurb. And so they're kind of learning about this whole approach or often seeing it all at the same time. So if they have questions like, is it playing? What are they doing? Then there's the explanation that I've written. But again, that's an exception, not a rule. Yeah. I mean, I've had, I think, Juanjo, you're in this, you're here. You've said, how do you measure learning? When Juanjo was here visiting a few months ago, there was a very genuine question as well. And like a question that I often get, how do you measure learning outcomes based on these simulations versus a traditional approach? And I pushed back. I said, well, a student being able to answer multiple choice questions or to, cram the night before and maybe respond in an appropriate way to a short answer question. Is that learning? I think with these simulations, they're not the only way that students should be learning. They're a complement to robust and directed research, reading, student discussions, writing, reflecting. It's part of it's one tool in the teacher toolkit. But I think it should be one that's utilized often, because if students don't care or if they have if they're not, I don't know. I feel like they need an emotional engagement, a connection. And this is a way for them to emotionally engage and connect. And then the learning is more meaningful. So that was a really long answer. I'm sorry. Yeah, Juanjo, sorry if I apologize if I misrepresented the question. It was part of a much bigger discussion.
Okay, Brian, I don't know if I can talk now. So thank you very much for your thought. I think it's interesting. I'm a real advocate of the way of you teach based on simulations, on components of gamification. I think you are working towards, developing, as you said before, reflection, critical thinking. You also base your educational strategies into, solving dilemmas. So I think this is very much important in nowadays society, especially, with the increasing, stepping, into our classroom of the artificial intelligence. So I have a question for you now that I want, to have your input. what would you think are the AI, threats that can pose, into your classroom? Because in your case, from my point of view, since you are very kind of far away of traditional way of teaching, so you can, you can keep on, doing what you do because you are working, those abilities or soft skills, and like engagement, critical thinking, reflection, and so on. So do you think artificial intelligence may be threatening for you in the future, as the way you teach?
That's a great question. Thank you. I think in fact, the way I teach is less threatened by artificial intelligence than perhaps more, I don't want to say more traditional, but then some other ways of teaching. So for example, if a student needs to read an article and write a reflection on it, a clever student can feed the article into AI, and it's getting more refined. The students can feed their own writing in, so AI is writing in their voice. They can't, but if the assignment is to read an article and connect the article to a personal experience that a student had through a simulation or through a game, that the amount of work they'd have to do explaining their experience to AI for AI to generate a reflection like that would be, I mean, honestly, if they did it, then it's probably more work than just generating the things themselves. And so I think these really, and no simulation is ever the same. And so like it's always, there's always things that happen. There's always different strategies and students, coming up with clever workarounds and things that I hadn't anticipated. And so the more individualized the experience, the harder it is to get AI to help reflect or connect on that experience, if that makes any sense.
Yep, perfectly. Yeah, thank you. I personally am in the, in the same way of thinking as you do. So congratulations. I think it's you are doing an outstanding work with with the simulations and all of the way you teach. Yeah.
And something I do just want to say here again is this isn't something I probably should have offered at the beginning, but I think that this is one tool in a teacher toolkit, and it really can help with things like, flipped classrooms, using the classroom time to run through the simulations, then having students engaging with primary, secondary sources, or outside of the classroom, either before or after. So with the collective agriculture simulation, the students didn't do any pre-research. Because if they had, then they would have known that they shouldn't exterminate the 4 pests. And I don't want them, I want them to go, I don't want them, to think, oh, we're going to make this decision because we know what the outcome is. It's like, no, I want it to be as, as organic as possible. And so then they did, but then they did some reading and some research outside of the classroom, and then reflected on their experience and looked at, well, what was, what parts were realistic based on the research you've done, and what wasn't, what would you maybe add? And so that's also quite I think, a very good experience. If there's any other, Paul has a hand up, and then Robert.
Yeah. Hi everyone. Hi Brian. Sorry I joined the call a bit late. I've been jumping around meetings here this morning in Austria. The perks or the downsides of being in admin and teaching.
Yes.
I visited your school a couple of years ago, and I don't know if we might have met briefly, but anyway, maybe it's already been mentioned because I missed the earlier parts of the call, but yeah, I'm in a school where we do have high stakes testing, and I'm doing a PhD in STEAM Edu, where we're trying to do more project-based learning and not have that reliance on high stakes testing, but it's still gonna be there for the next few years. So I'm looking for, you know, arguments for, against, because I know your school does diploma program, but maybe not all of your students go on to do that. Do they move elsewhere and pursue other educational paths?
So in terms of, it's a great question. I'm at the 10th grade level, so I'm right
Yeah,
before
yeah.
IB, so before they're making
yeah,
the choice
yeah.
about diploma program or
Yeah,
not.
yeah.
But it doesn't mean that I don't have a responsibility to students to help them develop the skills that they will need at the diploma. I mean, if that's probably my you know,
Yeah.
okay, you know, full disclosure, I would say my most sacred responsibility is, you know, trying is to try and really create a spark in students that they that they're curious and want to engage with history
Yeah.
throughout the rest of their lives.
Yeah.
Then, but then less
Exactly,
lofty
yeah.
and
The
more
other hat.
specific are making sure that they're prepared. And so, with things like the statecraft simulation, I don't know if you were here when I was talking.
No, I didn't. Is there, how do I get hold of that? Is there a link or somewhere you can point me to, or is this
I'm happy
a
to-
program that you've paid for? What?
So yeah, so the statecraft simulation, it's actually something a college professor, I did it in university.
Okay.
And I run it with high school students. It was developed as a PhD project by a professor, and then some very industrious students a few years after me developed it into something that could be scaled.
Okay.
But it's incredible. But along with that, I have students doing I look at the IB English assessments and IB history and IB economics. And so things like IAs and commentaries. And alongside the simulation, they're required to do, I would say, IB light assignments. But the simulation is the sort of the center of gravity. They either have to, they're inspired by something that happened and then go on a research, you know, journey, or they reflect back to the simulation. So they either say, well, this is interesting, and so I want to study the war, you know, the formation of Warsaw Pact or NATO because there was collective security, and they go on that pathway. Or students who have a little bit less direction, or maybe they're going to study economics. We look at the value of certain resources in the simulation, and then they do something more akin to a economics article commentary. So it's using the simulation as like a center of gravity, but and then putting having those more prescribed types of assignments like as part of the simulation.
Did I find the right link? If you check in the chat, is that the one you're talking about?
statecraftsims.com, yeah. And I'm happy to I'm in no way like, you know, I don't get any kickbacks or anything, but
yeah.
I'd be happy to put people in touch with
yeah, please, that would be just intriguing to know a bit more. Yeah.
And I'm happy to continue this conversation at people's leisure. If I'll share my contact information or ECIS.
I would like that. I don't know about anyone else, but yes, please. Yeah.
Feel free to be in touch next year. And something I do want to say, because I know people might be needing to leave soon, I'm happy to stay for another 20 minutes or so, is next year I will be hosting a small, or the plan right now is to be hosting a small conference here at LAS based on simulations. So and it will be very much an unconference, in the sense that it's not just coming and talking about it. It's like teachers come, we do the simulation, then there will be hopefully subject area specialists, and then also some, let's say, game mechanic specialists, aka dungeon masters from who are just in the local community, and putting people together to work out problems of simulations, or to offer feedback about ways that things can be better, or and the idea is that people after 2 or 3 days would leave with a number of simulations that they can implement in their classrooms if it's based on content that they cover. And then also just creating a network of people who do like this approach and or are invested in this approach and are interested in this approach, and just keeping that conversation going. So just plugging that a little bit. That will be in March of next year, I believe.
Yeah, please share your contact details, and I'd like to look more into that too as well.
Great. Paul, and so Robert, you had your hand up. Thank you for patiently waiting. Thanks for the question, Paul.
Brian, thank you very much for sharing all these experiences with us. They're really and truly inspiring. Something that called our attention here, I'm with Alejandro Postigo here in the PE department in Brussels, and we're surprised about the Lego wall activity that you did the year after with the snow. And we're thinking about sustainability, the way that you design these simulations in a sustainable way for you to reuse them in future years, but as well probably modifying certain areas of them depending on the context, the student population. So we wanted to ask you a little bit, what's your strategy at the time of designing these simulations so that they are sustainable for you, and that don't consume a huge amount of effort that the next year you cannot reuse. So that's a main question. Yeah.
No, it's a great question, and I think that's one of the it's perhaps one of the biggest questions as well, because you don't want to be, you do want things to be sustainable. So my goal is to build on what's working well, because the Indian Ocean trade simulation, for example, like that took some years to develop, and now it's basically I need a few people to help. I know where it fits well in my yearly plan. I know one double block class, which is 90 minutes, is enough time for it to run, and so it doesn't. But the first year, let's say it was a bit stop start and it took a little bit more investment. I'm lucky again to be at a school where not having those high stakes outside testing means that if my pacing needs to be if my pacing isn't totally dialed in, then I have some freedom and flexibility to make adjustments. Of course, you want it to be, right? Pacing is always one of the trickiest things with teachers, especially history teachers. There's so much we want to cover and so little time to cover everything. But going through the simulations, one way to do it is to run the simulations outside of class. So whether or not that's in an after school club, whether or not there's a study skills class or an independent study class, so you can sort of run the first versions of the simulation and work out the wrinkles so that when you're dedicating class time to it, that class time is going to be really really effectively used. And then another is just having a working group, or having people within your community where you can bounce ideas. And so whether or not it's Paul Magnuson or Travis Finneran, the guys that I work with here that I want to recognize, they're having a robust professional learning community is a way to help that out, a way to make sure that time is used efficiently. And then the conference that we're doing next year is also hopefully going to bring together a community of people interested in this approach, so that we're dividing and conquering. That is to say, if I'm running the first version of it, then I can give people the feedback, give people within this community the feedback and say, right, here's how it needs to be adjusted if your class is 50 minutes, if it's 90 minutes, if you don't have this time. And then so we're all benefiting from, rather than 20 different people needing to run the first version of it, everyone can benefit from one person running that first version. When it comes to the snow, you know, that was just I had the lesson. The Legos were actually the way to make that sustainable. The first year I ran it with snow, and then I thought, what if there's not snow every year? What can I use instead? And the Legos were, I was like, oh, and you know, there happened to be some Duplo Legos in our theater storage, and so I just grabbed those out and said, if it's not snowing, then I can use these. So
correct me if I am wrong. Like what I'm getting out of this is that in order to be sustainable, you want it to be replicable and resource independent, no? Kind of.
yeah, thank you. Yes, being concise is not necessarily my strong suit all the time.
No,
but
no, no.
that would be
Thank you very much, Brian.
and you know, having resources and resources and manipulatives that you can yeah, you can share with teachers, right? Like, so that, you know, they can print out things and cut things out, and then, you know, hopefully save those things from year to year, so that they're not having to create resource cards every time, but that it's, you know, that there are things that they can reuse. Good, Brendan.
Yeah, hi, Brian.
Hi.
I actually had a chance to visit your classroom with
Yes.
Paul, and I was part of that simulation. We did some trade in Indian Ocean. To be honest, history was never my favorite subject, but I really like to learn in your classroom with that experiential learning. I was impressed about your teaching at that time, but seeing other really interesting things that you did for teaching history, it's really amazing. I'm teaching at a university, and I have already taught and used some experiential learning in some of my classes. Thank you for inspiration. And I don't have a question, but I have a thought that you actually not teaching only the topic, but you are also integrating social emotional skills. You make students to use those skills. I think this is also a very important part of your teaching strategy. I think it's important. So just thank you. Thank you for presentation and what you did.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. Teşekkürler. Yeah, it's something, it's an interesting point that you make, you know, teenage, like especially 15, 16-year-olds. I may mess this quote up, but there's a book out there, and it's a quote for every year of your life. And I think 15 or 16-year-olds, the quote is something to the effect of, they're aware of all the contours of their own suffering, but unaware like the world suffers. And like it's that they, you know, cognitively they are at a certain place, and so in the history classroom, for them to be, you know, to try and ask them to like internalize and really understand conceptually all the things that have happened, and all the, you know, the scale of the human story, it's I mean, it's difficult for adults as well. And so if they're able to kind of embody a character for a moment, right? They're on a ship in the Indian Ocean, then that separation from themselves, I think, allows them to like allows them in some way a more authentic connection, which is perhaps a bit counterintuitive. But then when we think about, you know, there are certain tried and true methods that I think, you know, no one would really question, you know, learn like in English class, looking at narrative histories is never, I don't think that's something that would ever be questioned. There are very effective ways to learn about people in history, you know, things like the Diary of Anne Frank. And why is it such a powerful story? In large part because the students, when they're reading it, see themselves in the characters that they're reading about. And so creating an opportunity for them to, you know, play a character, embody a character, or think like a character is, I think, a really effective way for them to engage with historical concepts and also, yeah, social, you know, social skills and soft skills. Some more messages. So I do, yeah, we're running up on 55 minutes, and I'm aware that teachers have many things to do, especially this late in the year, so I don't want to keep anyone, but there will be a recording of this, and of course my contact information will be shared out. Thank you to everyone who's watched this. Thank you to everyone who took part in this. Thank you to ECIS and Paul Magnuson and the LAS Laser and Educational Research Arm for supporting this as well, and the administration for supporting me with this approach, because, you know, if I didn't have that, then I wouldn't have very much to present about. So thank you. Many thanks all around.